When you picture Medusa, you see the monster. You see the writhing snakes for hair, the glowing eyes, and the curse that turns anyone who meets her gaze into solid rock. In the story we all know, she is the ultimate final boss, a terrifying creature existing only to be slaughtered by the underdog hero Perseus. But if you trace her image back through thousands of years of art, that familiar monster disappears. The Medusa of ancient Greece didn't have snakes for hair, and she certainly wasn't a victim waiting for a hero. In her earliest depictions, she looks like this, a completely non-human beast with a grinning mouth and wild boar tusks protruding from her jaw. Then, centuries later, the tusks vanish. Artists began painting her like this, a profoundly human figure, capturing pure terror and agony in her severed head. Medusa's enduring power is her fluidity. For millennia, her face has been redesigned to reflect exactly what the society looking at her is most afraid of. The Greek poet Hesiod provides one of our oldest written records of the myth. He describes Medusa and her Gorgon sisters not as women, but as ancient, primal forces of nature living at the edge of the world. To early Greeks, the Gorgon face served a very specific, practical purpose. It was an apotropeic symbol, a horrific mask worn by priestesses to frighten away trespassers and protect sacred spaces from the profane. Mythologist Joseph Campbell looked at this practice and saw something much darker than a fairy tale. He argued the story of a hero severing Medusa's head is actually a repressed memory of a real physical conflict. Invading Hellenic tribes swept through the region in the 13th century BC, systematically overrunning established matriarchal goddess shrines. As invaders took control, they stripped local priestesses of their Gorgon masks. The Perseus myth became narrative shorthand for this violent dismantling of matriarchal power. This archaic monster functioned as a cultural coping mechanism, a way to process a violent invasion and the collapse of an older religion. As centuries passed and the actual invasions faded from memory, the Greeks and Romans began softening Medusa's image. Sculptors traded her tusks for fair cheeks, portraying a beautiful woman killed in her sleep. The Roman poet Ovid eventually formalized this shift, completely rewriting her origin story into a narrative of intense victimization. In Ovid's version, Medusa is born a gorgeous mortal maiden. While worshipping inside the sacred temple of Athena, she is cornered and assaulted by the sea god Poseidon. But Athena doesn't direct her wrath at Poseidon, she turns on the victim. The goddess transforms Medusa's hair into serpents, cursing her to a life of isolation so she can never be loved again. That tragic narrative survived into the 20th century, where male thinkers eagerly used it to project their own psychological insecurities. Sigmund Freud looked at the severed, snake-covered head and diagnosed it as a direct manifestation of male castration anxiety. Writers like Jack London took a different angle. He argued that looking into Medusa's eyes meant confronting the terrifying, meaningless reality of a nihilistic universe. In every one of these iterations, Medusa is denied her own voice. From classical poets to modern psychoanalysts, she functioned entirely as a blank canvas for male authority figures to paint their deepest fears. Then, in the late 20th century, the cultural lens shifted again. Women began to re-examine the myth, and instead of seeing a cautionary tale or a monster, they recognized themselves. Feminist theorist Helene Cixous captured this momentum in her landmark essay, The Laugh of the Medusa. Cixous argued that the men who wrote and retold the myth deliberately demonized Medusa because they were terrified of female desire and autonomy. Feminists actively reclaimed that ancient Gorgon mask. They embraced her savage, threatening appearance, adopting it as a recognized symbol of justified female rage and a fierce protector of women's secrets. As a survivor of sexual assault who was blamed and punished for her own abuse, Medusa's narrative directly parallels modern political struggles. It explains why her image resonates so strongly within the #MeToo movement today. The curse has been entirely reversed. Women no longer look at Medusa and freeze in terror. They look at her and find the strength to speak out. Myths are not static history. They are living mirrors. Medusa survives today because a new generation finally stopped running from the monster and recognized her as a reflection of their own survival.